close your eyes for a moment. Imagine standing at the edge of a forest. No roads, no signs, no phone in your pocket. Just trees stretching in every direction as far as you can see. The wind moves through the branches. Birds call to each other somewhere above you. And you need to walk 50 miles to reach your people. You have no map. You have no compass. You have never been to this exact place before. But you are not afraid, because your grandmother taught you to read the moss on tree trunks. Your father showed you how the stars move through the night sky like a slow river. You know which direction the geese fly in autumn. You know that water always runs toward lower ground. You know the names of every plant along this trail, and those plants will tell you exactly where you are if you know how to listen. You take a breath, and you walk. This is how millions of people lived on this continent for at least 15,000 years, maybe longer. They moved across mountains and deserts and frozen plains and dense forests without a single printed map, without GPS, without compass needles or measuring wheels. And they never got lost. Not because they were lucky, not because they had some magical sense that modern people lack, but because they had built something even more powerful than a map. They had built a living relationship with the land itself. Here is what nobody tells you about Native American navigation. The trails, the routes, the pathways that these peoples used were not random. They were not improvised. They were some of the most sophisticated travel networks ever created on this planet. Many of them had been in use for thousands of years before a single European set foot on this continent. And when those Europeans finally arrived and needed roads of their own, they built them right on top of the old native trails, because those trails were already perfect. The highways you drive on today, the railroad lines that cross this country. Many of them follow paths that were first walked by feet that belong to people whose names we will never know. That is the secret at the heart of tonight's story. How did they do it? How did human beings navigate an entire continent the size of North America with nothing but their own minds and bodies, and the world around them? The answer is going to change how you think about intelligence. It is going to change how you think about memory. And somewhere in that answer, if you listen carefully enough, you might find something about yourself that you did not expect. If you are listening to fall asleep, this is exactly what these stories are for. Before you drift off, I would love to know where you are right now. What city? What country? What time is it? Where you lie in the dark. People listen from places as different as the Australian outback and the streets of Chicago and a small town in Scotland where it rains most of the year. All of us connected through stories about the people who walked this earth before us. If you enjoy these journeys, the subscribe button is there when you wake up. For now, just rest and listen, because this story is about to get very deep and very old and very beautiful. The first paths. Before we can understand how Native Americans traveled, we need to understand something about the land they were traveling through. North America 15,000 years ago looked almost nothing like it does today. Massive glaciers still covered much of the northern continent. They were so heavy they pushed the land itself down by hundreds of feet. When those glaciers finally melted, sea levels rose dramatically. Coastlines that exist today were underwater, and coastlines that now sit under the ocean were once dry land where people walked and built fires and raised children. The world was changing, and people moved with it. The earliest peoples on this continent were not sitting still. They were following the animals. Mammoths and mastodons and giant ground sloths moved through landscapes that no human alive has ever seen. And the hunters who followed them developed the first travel knowledge on this continent. They noticed things. They noticed that certain mountain passes only opened for a few weeks each year when the snow melted. They noticed that particular river crossings were safe in summer but deadly in spring floods. They noticed that a specific rock formation always appeared on the horizon when you were 3 days' walk from a certain water source. They noticed the way the light looked different when you were heading east versus west in the early morning. And they remembered. This is where the story of Native American navigation truly begins. Not with trails carved into earth, not with monuments or markers, but with memory. Human memory trained to hold an entire landscape inside itself, the way a library holds books. Modern scientists have a term for this kind of memory. They call it spatial cognition. The ability to hold a mental map of the world around you and navigate by it. All humans have this ability to some degree. We use it every time we walk through a familiar neighborhood without thinking about where to turn. But the spatial cognition of peoples who live close to the land is something else entirely. Studies of traditional navigation cultures around the world have documented individuals who can describe the exact location of every water source within a territory covering thousands of square miles, who can predict which canyon will hold snow in March, who can smell rain coming from a specific direction before a single cloud appears on the horizon, who can look at the way grass bends in a field and tell you which animal passed through it, and roughly how long ago. This is not magic. This is not some lost human ability that modern people no longer possess. It is skill. Deep, practiced, carefully taught skill. The kind that takes years to build and lifetimes to perfect. The young people of native nations did not simply absorb this knowledge by accident. They were taught, deliberately, systematically, by elders who had been taught by their own elders in an unbroken chain of instruction that reached back thousands of years. And the first thing they were taught was this: the land is alive, the land communicates. Your job is to learn its language. Learning the language of the land. Imagine being 7 years old. You wake before sunrise in a camp near a river in what will one day be called Ohio. The air smells like mud and cold water and wood smoke from the fire that has been burning all night. Your grandmother is already awake. She always is. She does not say good morning. She says, "Listen. What do you hear?" You listen. Birds. But not just birds. A specific kind of bird calling from the east. Another kind answering from the south. The sound of water moving around rocks somewhere downstream. A sound you cannot name yet. A soft thudding that your grandmother tells you is a deer walking through dry leaves about 200 yards north of where you sit. This is your classroom. Every morning of your childhood. Native American navigation education did not happen in buildings. It happened in the field. Children accompanied adults from the earliest age. They watched, they listened, they were asked questions constantly. What does that cloud mean? What direction is the wind coming from? If we followed that stream, where would it take us? How many days' walk is it to the big bend in the river? The answers came slowly, over years, because the land itself was the textbook, and the textbook was infinite. One of the most important skills taught was the ability to read the sky, not just at night with the stars, though that was crucial. But all day long, the position of the sun at different times of year, the way clouds formed over mountains versus open plains, the direction that certain types of birds migrated, the behavior of the wind at different elevations. The Lakota people of the Great Plains had a sophisticated understanding of cloud formations that modern meteorologists have since confirmed is often more accurate in predicting local weather than standard weather station data. They could look at the shape and color and movement of clouds and tell you with remarkable precision whether rain was 6 hours away or 6 days away, whether the storm would be severe or gentle, whether it would arrive from the northwest or the southwest. This was not guesswork. This was pattern recognition refined over generations of careful observation. The same was true for animal behavior. The movement of bison herds across the plains was not random. It followed patterns. Seasonal patterns, yes, but also patterns driven by water, by grass growth, by predator pressure. A skilled observer could read those patterns and use them as a navigational guide. If the bison were moving southwest in late autumn, it meant something specific about where the good winter grazing was. And that information pointed you toward water and shelter. Animals are the oldest navigators on Earth. Native peoples understood this. They used animal behavior as a living compass, letting the knowledge encoded in the bodies of other creatures guide their own movement through the world. But perhaps the most remarkable navigation skill was the one taught most carefully to young people. It was the ability to memorize the land through story. This is where the journey gets truly extraordinary. The star roads and the song trails. Picture a night sky without any light pollution at all. No city glow, no street lamps, no distant highways, just absolute darkness. And above it, a sky so thick with stars that the Milky Way looks almost solid. A river of light stretched from horizon to horizon. This is what every night sky looked like for every human being on Earth until about 200 years ago. This is the sky that Native Americans navigated by for thousands of years. The stars were not just beautiful to these peoples. They were a map that was always overhead, always visible, always reliable. And unlike a paper map, it could never be lost or stolen or destroyed. Different nations used different constellations for different purposes. The Lakota and other plains peoples used the Big Dipper not just to find north, but to tell time. The position of the Dipper relative to the North Star changed throughout the night and throughout the year in ways that an experienced observer could read like a clock and a calendar combined. The Cherokee had names and stories for star patterns that European astronomers had never identified. Some of these star patterns marked the seasons. When certain stars rose at sunset, it was time to plant. When others appeared at dawn, it was time to harvest. When a particular constellation reached its highest point in the sky, it meant a certain mountain pass would be open for travel. The stars were a calendar and a compass and a clock, all at once. But navigating by stars only works at night, and humans need to travel during the day too. So what guided them then? This is where the story of Native American navigation becomes something almost impossible to believe until you understand the underlying logic. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples developed a system of navigation called songlines. These were songs that encoded landscape information. The melody and rhythm and lyrics of the song described the land itself, the mountains, the water sources, the distinctive trees, the rocks. If you knew the song, you could navigate a journey of hundreds of miles, even if you had never traveled that route before, because the song was the map. Native American peoples developed something remarkably similar. The oral traditions of many native nations contained embedded geographical information that functioned as navigational instructions. Stories about the trickster coyote might describe specific landscape features in precise enough detail to guide a listener who had never been to that region. Creation stories often traced the origins of rivers and mountains and plains in ways that constituted a detailed geographical survey. Ceremonial chants included place names and directional cues that, to an initiated listener, were precise enough to navigate by. This knowledge was not incidental. It was intentional. The stories were designed to carry geographic information across generations in a form that human memory could hold reliably. Think about that for a moment. Stories as navigation systems, memory as maps. This was not primitive technology. This was one of the most elegant information storage systems ever devised, because it did not require paper or ink or any material at all. It required only a human mind and a human voice. When scholars began documenting the oral traditions of various native nations in the 19th and early 20th centuries, many of them noted that the stories seemed to contain unusual amounts of specific geographical information. Landmarks were described with what seemed like unnecessary precision. Rivers were named and given characteristics. Mountains were placed in relation to each other. It took a long time for outside researchers to understand why. The stories were maps, and they had been working perfectly for thousands of years. The Great Trail Networks. Now let us come down from the sky and put our feet on the ground. Because as remarkable as star navigation and story maps were, the most visible legacy of Native American travel is written into the earth itself. Before European contact, North America was crossed by a network of trails so extensive and so carefully designed that it staggers the imagination. Historians and archaeologists have spent decades trying to map these routes, and they keep discovering more. Some of these trails were relatively local, used by a single community to move between seasonal camps, to reach fishing grounds or hunting territory, to visit neighboring villages. But others were something else entirely. They were continental routes, pathways that connected the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, that linked the Pacific coast to the Mississippi River Valley, that crossed the Rocky Mountains through specific passes chosen for their reliability and safety across all seasons. Archaeologists have identified one route called the Great Warrior Path that ran from what is now the Creek Nation territory in Alabama all the way north through the Appalachian Mountains to the Great Lakes. It was used for trade, for diplomacy, for seasonal migration. It was maintained by the communities along its length. And it was so well worn that European explorers following it in the 17th century estimated it must have been in use for centuries at least. We now know it was far older than that, much older. Another route, sometimes called the Old North Trail, ran along the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains for nearly 3,000 miles, from what is now Alberta in Canada all the way south through Montana and Wyoming and Colorado to the highlands of New Mexico. This was not a footpath. It was a highway, wide enough for parties of dozens of people traveling together, marked by stone cairns at intervals that functioned like the road signs of a different era. Archaeological evidence suggests this trail was in use for at least 8,000 years. 8,000 years. To put that in perspective, the Egyptian pyramids are about 4,500 years old. The people who walked this trail were walking it more than 3,000 years before the first stone was laid at Giza. When the modern Highway US Route 89 was built along the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains in the 20th century, engineers discovered that their chosen route almost exactly followed the path of the Old North Trail. Not because they were deliberately copying it, but because the trail had been built by people who understood the terrain so well that they had already found the optimal route. They had found it 8,000 years earlier. This is one of the most humbling facts in all of American history. Modern engineers with surveying equipment and geological surveys and aerial photography arrived at the same conclusions that unnamed human beings reached through walking and watching and remembering. The trails of Native America were not random. They were engineered. They chose low crossings over mountain ranges. They followed ridgelines where the walking was firm and the view was broad. They crossed rivers at fords that were shallow and stable, not at whatever happened to be closest. They skirted swamps and marshes rather than cutting through them. They connected water sources with the reliability of a planner who had thought through every possible contingency. Because that is exactly what the people who built and maintained them had done. They had thought through every contingency, over thousands of years. Guides and runners. There is another dimension to Native American travel that is easy to overlook: the role of the individual guide. Every major native nation had people who specialized in travel and navigation. Some were called by names that translate roughly as those who know the paths, or those who find the way. They were trained from childhood specifically for this role. Their knowledge was more extensive than that of a general community member. They knew routes that others did not know. They had traveled farther than most, and they made it their life's work to carry geographical knowledge that their people depended on. These individuals were not just walking encyclopedias. They were diplomats. They were the people who traveled between nations to arrange trade, to negotiate peace, to carry messages. Among the Iroquois nations, a confederacy of 6 nations in what is now upstate New York, there was a formal system of messengers called runners. These were men trained to travel at high speed over long distances, carrying information between communities. The Iroquois Confederacy covered a territory of thousands of square miles. Runners connected it like a nervous system. These runners could cover distances of up to 100 miles in a single day. That is not a misprint. 100 miles in a single day. On foot, through forest and over hills and across streams. They achieved this through training that began in childhood, through specific techniques of breathing and pacing, and through an intimate knowledge of their routes. They knew every turn, every rise, every place where the trail was slippery after rain. They did not need to slow down and look around. They had internalized the path so deeply that their bodies ran it almost automatically, while their minds stayed alert for anything unusual. The trail network maintained by the Iroquois Confederacy was one of the most efficient communication systems anywhere in the pre-industrial world. Messages could be transmitted from one end of their territory to the other in just a few days. This speed of communication was one of the factors that made the Confederacy so politically powerful. They could coordinate responses to distant events faster than their neighbors could even understand what was happening. The Apache peoples of the Southwest developed their own tradition of long-distance running and navigation that has become legendary. Apache runners trained in environments that seem almost impossibly hostile to outsiders: the Sonoran Desert in summer, the high desert plateaus of New Mexico in winter, the rugged canyons of the Arizona highlands. They moved through these environments with a combination of physical conditioning and ecological knowledge that allowed them to travel distances and routes that still astonish modern military trainers who have studied their techniques. Part of their secret was water knowledge. In a desert, knowing where water is becomes more important than almost any other skill. Apache guides had memorized the location of every tinaja, every hidden spring, every seasonal waterhole across territory covering hundreds of square miles. Some of these water sources were visible only if you knew exactly where to look. A small seep in the base of a cliff, a catch basin hidden behind a rock formation, a seasonal stream that ran underground for most of its length and surfaced only in one specific place. This was not information you could figure out by looking at the landscape as a newcomer. It was information passed from person to person over generations. It was the kind of knowledge that meant the difference between surviving a desert crossing and dying of thirst. The knowledge was power, and it was shared generously within the community, because in a world where the land could kill you, sharing knowledge was survival. Reading the earth itself. Let us talk about the earth under your feet. Modern people mostly walk on pavement, or on carpet, or on floors of wood or tile or concrete. We have created an entire civilization dedicated to separating our feet from the ground. Traditional peoples walked on earth, on stone, on sand, on mud, on grass, on snow. And in doing so, they learned to read the ground itself as a text. Trackers among various native nations developed the ability to read footprints and animal signs with a precision that to outside observers seemed almost supernatural. But it was not supernatural. It was the result of training in careful observation over many years. A skilled tracker could look at a footprint and tell you not just what animal made it, but roughly how heavy it was, how fast it was moving, whether it was injured, whether it was alert or relaxed, how long ago it passed, which direction it was heading, and roughly how far it had traveled. They could read these things because they had spent years learning every variable that affected how a print looked in every type of ground. Soft mud made wider, shallower prints than firm soil. A reeling animal pushed down harder on the toes than the heel. A tired animal dragged its feet slightly. Rain altered print edges in predictable ways depending on when the rain fell relative to when the print was made. This level of observational skill extended to the reading of vegetation, bent grass, broken twigs, disturbed leaf litter. Each of these spoke to anyone who had learned the language. But trackers did not just read what had passed. They used this knowledge to navigate. If a deer trail consistently ran northeast in the mornings and returned southwest in the evenings, that was information about where water was, where feeding grounds were, where the deer sheltered at midday. A skilled tracker could follow deer trails to find resources the deer had already located. The animals became a kind of advance scouting party that had already done the work of mapping the local landscape. This relationship between human navigation and animal knowledge ran through virtually every native tradition on the continent. Animals were not just food sources, they were teachers. They were indicators. They were fellow navigators whose movements through the landscape encoded information that a careful observer could decode. The Lewis and Clark expedition in the early 1800s is famous as a journey of exploration into unknown territory. What is less often mentioned is how extensively Lewis and Clark relied on native guides to travel that territory. Without the knowledge of peoples like the Shoshone and the Nez Perce, the expedition would almost certainly have failed. Died in the mountains, or lost on the plains, or unable to navigate the river systems of the Pacific Northwest. Sacagawea, the young Shoshone woman who traveled with the expedition, was not just a translator. She was a navigator. She recognized landmarks. She knew which passes could be crossed and which could not. She understood the river systems of the interior in ways that no member of the expedition could have acquired in less than a lifetime. She was not unusual. She was the product of a tradition of careful landscape knowledge that was common throughout Native America. She just happened to be in a position where that knowledge was documented by outsiders who recognized its value. The seasons, as a calendar of travel navigation, is not just about knowing where you are. It is about knowing when to move and when to stay. Native American peoples developed a relationship with seasonal cycles that was more precise and more practical than almost anything in the modern world. They knew not just that winter was cold and summer was warm. They knew the specific rhythms of the specific places where they lived. They knew which plants signaled which transitions. They knew the behavior of which animals predicted which weather patterns. Among the Anishinaabe peoples of the Great Lakes region, there was a detailed seasonal calendar that governed almost every aspect of community life, including travel. The calendar was not just about the 4 seasons that most modern people think of. It divided the year into as many as 13 distinct periods, each with its own character, its own resources, its own travel conditions. The sugar maple sap ran in late winter before the snow was fully gone. That was a time to move toward the maple groves, often following specific trails that led to specific groves that families or clans had used for generations. The walleye spawning run in spring pulled people toward certain rivers. The wild rice harvest in late summer required a specific journey to specific wetlands at a specific time. The fall hunting required movement to specific territories where deer and elk concentrated for the rut. Every one of these seasonal movements followed routes that had been traveled for generations. Every one of them was timed to ecological events that were predictable enough to plan around. And every one of them required a deep knowledge of the landscape to execute safely. This seasonal pattern of movement has been called transhumance by anthropologists. Moving with the seasons, following the food and the resources as they became available across the landscape. It is the opposite of the sedentary life that most modern people live. And it required an intimate knowledge of geography that most modern people have completely lost. But here is the remarkable thing. This knowledge was not just practical. It was also beautiful. The Algonquin peoples gave names to each full moon that reflected the ecological character of that time of year. The wolf moon in January, when wolves howled with hunger in the cold. The worm moon in March, when the ground thawed enough for earthworms to emerge. The strawberry moon in June, marking the brief season of ripening fruit. The harvest moon in autumn, full and bright enough to work by, perfect for the last long journeys before winter. These names were not just poetry. They were a calendar of travel, a system of timing that told you where to be and when, encoded in language that was easy to remember because it was linked to beauty. The knowledge was kept alive because it was made beautiful. And being beautiful, it was taught to children who carried it into their own adulthood and taught it in turn to theirs. Trade and the long roads. Now, let us talk about something that truly reframes what we think we know about pre-contact North America: the trading networks. Before European contact, Native American peoples had established trade networks that covered the entire continent, not in a vague, occasional way, in a specific, systematic, intentional way. Goods moved along these routes with a regularity and an efficiency that rivals anything in the ancient world. Copper from the shores of Lake Superior appeared in burial mounds in the Ohio Valley, hundreds of miles away. Obsidian from volcanic sources in what is now Wyoming appeared in campsites in Mississippi. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico appeared in sites in Minnesota. Turquoise from New Mexico appeared along the Pacific coast. These objects did not travel by accident. They traveled because there were routes to carry them, people to carry them, and a system of relationships between communities that made the exchange possible. The trail networks we talked about earlier were not just routes for seasonal migration. They were trade highways, and along them moved not just goods, but ideas, designs and techniques and stories and songs, crop varieties and medicinal knowledge, political relationships and marriage alliances. The trading center of Cahokia, near what is now East St. Louis in Illinois, was at its height around the year 1100 AD, one of the largest cities in the world. Its population has been estimated at somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people. It was larger than London at the same date, and goods from as far as 1,000 miles away found their way to its markets. The people who organized this trade needed to know the routes. They needed to navigate not just physically, but diplomatically, to know which nations allowed passage through their territory and under what conditions, to understand the protocols for approaching a foreign community in peace, to carry the right goods for the right exchanges. They needed, in other words, to be expert navigators in the fullest sense, not just geographers, but diplomats and cultural translators. And they were. The importance of water. Here is something that seems obvious once you hear it, but changes everything about how you think about Native American travel. Water is the oldest highway on Earth. Rivers do not just carry fish, they carry boats. And in North America, the river systems are extraordinarily extensive. The Mississippi and Missouri river systems alone drain almost half the entire continent. Add the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence, and the rivers of the Pacific Northwest, and the rivers of the Southeast, and you begin to understand that much of the interior of North America was accessible by water. Native peoples understood this completely. They built watercraft specific to the environments they navigated. The birch bark canoe of the northeastern peoples was one of the most sophisticated small boats ever designed. It was light enough for one person to carry over a portage, strong enough to carry hundreds of pounds of cargo, shallow enough to navigate streams only inches deep, and stable enough to handle the open waters of the Great Lakes, the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, the Ojibwe, the Cree, the Algonquin. These peoples did not just use canoes as transportation. They built entire civilizations around the canoe as the fundamental unit of travel and trade. Their trail networks connected river systems with portage routes, short overland carries from one river to another that allowed a traveler to move from one watershed to the next without ever being far from water. A traveler could leave what is now the Atlantic coast of Canada and, using canoes and portage routes, reach the interior of what is now Minnesota entirely by water, or travel from the Gulf of Mexico up the Mississippi and Ohio River systems to the headwaters of the Allegheny and portage into the Great Lakes drainage. The continent was not an obstacle, it was a network. The people who navigated these waterways read the rivers as carefully as they read the sky. They knew which sections were passable in which seasons. They knew where rapids lay hidden around a bend. They knew which tributaries ran dry in summer and which ran full with snowmelt in spring. They knew how the behavior of the current changed in different weather conditions. They knew the sounds of a waterfall before they could see it. Skilled river navigators could travel at night by water, using the sound of the current and the feel of the boat on the water to stay in the channel. They could cross open lake water in darkness using star navigation. They could read weather systems building over open water hours before the storm arrived, giving them time to reach shore. The Pacific Northwest peoples took this mastery of water to its most extreme expression. The coastal nations of what is now British Columbia and Alaska were blue water navigators. They traveled in ocean-going canoes carved from single cedar logs, sometimes 60 feet long. They crossed open ocean in these vessels. They navigated by the stars and the swells and the behavior of seabirds and the color and temperature of the water. Some researchers believe that Pacific Northwest canoes reached as far south as Hawaii before European contact, though this remains debated. What is not debated is that these peoples navigated among the islands and channels of the Pacific Northwest coast with a precision and confidence that astonished the first European sailors who encountered them. The Europeans had compasses, they had printed charts, they had sextants and chronometers, and they were still frequently lost in those waters, running onto rocks and reefs that native navigators had known and avoided for centuries. The knowledge in the hands and memories of the people who lived there was worth more than all the instruments in the European hold. Passing it on. Now think about what it would take to pass all of this knowledge on. Think about everything we have talked about. The star positions and their seasonal changes, the animal behavior patterns, the water sources, the trail networks covering thousands of miles, the seasonal timing, the river systems, the weather patterns, the plant indicators, the trade routes and diplomatic protocols. This is an enormous body of knowledge. Modern scientists have careers devoted to understanding single pieces of it. How did native peoples transmit all of this from one generation to the next, without writing, without printed maps, without any of the storage media we depend on today? The answer is both simple and profound. They stored it in human beings. Children were not just taught navigation facts, they were taken on journeys. From a very young age, children traveled with their families and communities. They experienced the routes. They felt the ground under their feet. They saw the landmarks with their own eyes. They slept under the stars on the trails. They crossed the rivers at the fords. The knowledge was not stored in external media. It was stored in living bodies and living minds, in the muscles that remembered a particular hill climb, in the nose that had smelled that particular spring before, in the ear that had heard that particular bird at that particular bend in the river. Bodily knowledge. Knowledge that lived in experience, not in text. Elders were the libraries. When a person who had travelled widely and observed carefully for decades sat down with young people and told them stories, they were not just entertaining them. They were downloading an entire geographical database into the next generation. The precision of this transmission has been confirmed in recent decades by a remarkable field of study: indigenous geography. Researchers working with native elders have discovered that oral traditions often contain startlingly accurate geographical information, including information about landscapes and events from thousands of years ago. Some Aboriginal Australian oral traditions appear to contain accurate descriptions of coastal features that were submerged by rising sea levels more than 7,000 years ago. If this interpretation is correct, it means the oral tradition preserved accurate geographical knowledge across more than 300 generations. 300 generations. Without a single written word. Without a single map. Just human voice and human memory. Generation after generation passing the world forward. There is nothing primitive about this. It is one of the most extraordinary feats of information management in human history. What was lost and what remains. We need to talk about something difficult for a moment, because this story is not only a story of ancient wonder, it is also a story of loss. When European colonization of North America began in earnest in the 16th and 17th centuries, the trail networks and the navigational knowledge they represented became targets, not always deliberately, sometimes simply through the devastating effect of disease, which killed as many as 90% of the population of some native nations before a single European soldier arrived. When the people who carried the knowledge died, the knowledge died with them. And sometimes the destruction was deliberate. The forced removal of native peoples from their ancestral lands destroyed the relationship between communities and the specific landscapes they had learned to read over generations. When the Cherokee were forced west along the Trail of Tears in 1838, they left behind not just homes and graves. They left behind a country of hills and rivers and mountains that they had known in every detail for thousands of years. And they arrived in an unknown landscape in Oklahoma that they had to learn again from the beginning. The boarding school systems that operated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, designed explicitly to destroy native cultures and languages, also destroyed the systems by which navigational and ecological knowledge was transmitted. When children were forbidden to speak their languages, they were forbidden to learn the stories and songs that carried geographical information. When they were forced to sit indoors memorizing European texts instead of traveling the land with their elders, the chain of transmission was broken. The loss is real, and it is ongoing. But the story does not end with loss, because the knowledge was not entirely destroyed. It survived. In places, in people, in communities that found ways to maintain their traditions despite everything. Today, there is a growing movement among native nations to document, restore, and transmit traditional ecological and geographical knowledge. Young people are learning from elders. Trails that had been forgotten are being walked again. Plant knowledge that had nearly been lost is being recorded. Navigation techniques that had survived only in the memories of the oldest living practitioners are being taught to children who will carry them forward. This is not nostalgia. This is not pretending that the modern world does not exist. It is the recognition that knowledge accumulated over thousands of years of careful observation is valuable, that it has something to teach, that the people who developed it deserve to have it remembered, and it is the recognition that the land itself is still there, still speaking, still offering its information to anyone who learns how to listen. The stars are the same. Here is something that might feel strange and then might feel beautiful. The stars that Native American navigators used to find their way are the same stars you can see tonight if you step outside. The North Star is still there. Polaris, sitting almost motionless above the North Pole, has guided human beings for as long as human beings have looked up. The Big Dipper still traces its long, slow circle around it. The Pleiades, the cluster of 7 stars that so many different cultures around the world have named and given stories, still rises in autumn and sets in spring. Orion still stands in the winter sky with his belt of 3 stars pointing roughly east and west. The sky has not changed. And in another sense, neither have we. The same mind that watched those stars thousands of years ago, the same cognitive abilities, the same capacity for pattern recognition and spatial memory and careful observation, that mind is still inside every human being alive today. We have simply stopped using it. We have outsourced our navigation to small glass rectangles in our pockets. We have outsourced our weather knowledge to television meteorologists. We have outsourced our relationship with the land to the systems of industrial civilization. But the capacity is still there, waiting. People who spend time in wilderness, who practice tracking, who learn to observe the natural world, often report something that feels almost like waking up, as if senses that had been dormant suddenly became active again, as if the world became more vivid, more specific, more real. This is not self-improvement marketing. This is neurological fact. The human brain is an organ evolved for exactly this kind of engaged observational relationship with the natural environment. When we practice it, the brain responds with something that functions like joy. Your ancestors knew this. They lived it every day. And some part of you, some very old part, still carries it. You are the latest traveler. Think for a moment about the trails. 8,000 years ago, a person walked through the land that would one day become Montana. They were following a route they had learned from their parents. The route their parents had learned from their parents, going back and back into a past that none of them could see, but all of them could feel in the soles of their feet. They passed a mountain. The mountain is still there. They crossed a river. The river is still there. They looked up at the stars. The stars are still there. And in a very real sense, that person is still there too. In you. In your DNA. In the cognitive wiring of your brain that was shaped by millions of years of human beings navigating the world on foot, by memory and observation and story. Every time you get a feeling about which way to turn, even in a city, every time you notice the direction of the sun without thinking about it, every time you recognize a landscape that feels familiar even though you have never been there before, that is the old navigator in you, still awake, still paying attention. The world has changed beyond recognition since those first trails were worn into the earth of North America. We live in a world those original travelers could not have imagined. But the relationship between a human being and the earth they stand on is older than civilization, older than agriculture, older than language itself. It is built into what we are. When we look at the navigational knowledge of Native American peoples, what we are really looking at is a mirror. We are seeing what human intelligence looks like when it is fully engaged with the natural world. We are seeing what memory can do when it is trained and practiced and nurtured over generations. We are seeing what a relationship with the earth looks like when it is treated as a living relationship rather than a resource to be extracted. And somewhere in that mirror, we might see something we have forgotten about ourselves, something that is still there, still possible, still true. The trail is still there. It has always been there. You just need to know how to look. A final journey. Before you sleep, let us take one last walk together. It is dusk, somewhere in the interior of this continent. The light is going golden, then orange, then pink along the western horizon. The first stars are appearing in the east. It is cool. There is the smell of sage, or cedar, or the cold, clean smell of a river nearby. You are walking a trail that has been walked by human feet for longer than memory reaches. The path is worn smooth by 10,000 years of passage. Your feet know where to go without you thinking about it. The land tells you. An elder is walking beside you. She has walked this trail 100 times. She knows every turn, every stone, every tree that grows at a bend in the path. She is telling you a story as you walk. The story contains the shape of the land, the position of the water, the place where a particular kind of plant grows that can ease a fever. You are not just listening, you are learning. You are becoming a carrier of knowledge that will outlast you if you pass it on. Above you, the stars are coming out one by one, the same stars that guided every journey across this continent for thousands of years. Steady, reliable. There, every night, if you know where to look. You do not need a phone. You do not need a map. You have something much older and much more powerful. You have a mind shaped by 200,000 years of human beings learning the language of this earth. The elder finishes her story. You have arrived somewhere, though you're not sure exactly when you started or stopped walking. You lie down on the ground or on a bed of dry grass, or in whatever shelter the land provides. The fire is nearby, the stars are overhead, and the knowledge that carries every trail, every river, every mountain, every sky, it rests now too. It does not go anywhere. It waits in you, patient as stone, deep as water. Tomorrow there will be more walking, more learning, more listening, but tonight you rest. The trail will be there in the morning. The stars will be there. And somewhere in the country of your sleeping mind, the old navigator is already tracing tomorrow's route by the light of 100,000 ancient fires. Sleep well. The land knows you are here.